In 1989, Nintendo made a very innovative break in the handheld scene with the Game Boy. However, its innovative nature came from harboring best handheld experiences that could have possibly been obtained. In many ways, this device was lacking greatly in terms of its technical capabilities, which include the screen, comfort, and performance, aspects which Sega believed they could overcome if they created a handheld themselves. As such, a device that was far ahead of its time debuted in 1990 and made its way worldwide by 1992. The device to finally dethrone the Game Boy from its spot was dubbed the Sega Game Gear, a system with every incredible feature that backfired on itself and made it a failure. Game Gear launched during a very interesting time. This was around the turn of the third generation of console gaming, where Sega's Master System struggled to compete against the NES sales-wise, considering the stranglehold that Nintendo had on the market at this time. But in terms of technicalities, the Master System was definitely more capable than the NES, even if not as many people really got to experience it. But Sega just wasn't as popular as Nintendo at this time, which kept the Master System as a highly beloved console in specific regions, which include Brazil and Australia, while not having nearly as strong of an impact in regions like North America. And to capitalize even further on the popularity of the NES, Nintendo launched a handheld gaming system, their very first one since the Game & Watch, if you can call it that, the Game Boy. This device was incredibly popular as well, being decently affordable, especially compared to something like the Atari Lynx, which was about $200 at the time, or even the Turbo Express, which was $300. Clearly, the Game Boy had a massive advantage, even if technically it wasn't as impressive as those other handhelds. But these limitations were still notable. The lack of a backlight, colors, and a comfortable grip were all things that the Game Boy was lacking. Now, frankly speaking, the Game Boy screen was not pretty to look at, and it could only be played under an external light source. So clearly, there were shortcomings that could have been targeted, and Sega were the ones to try and address these as affordably as possible. That's when the Game Gear entered the scene in Japan in 1990, and in 1991 in the Americas and Europe. The system launched at just $150, which, while roughly $60 more than the Game Boy, it offered important features that allowed it to stand out. The Game Gear is significantly different from the Game Boy, and it features a look that is very distinctly Sega. This handheld is quite large, and it has this matte dark gray color that aesthetically resembles the Genesis, which came out at around the same time, particularly because of the roundedness of this device, of course. On the front, you will find a D-pad, 1, 2, and start buttons, a single speaker, and the screen itself. This D-pad is pretty similar to the one that you would find on a Master System controller, which is to say that it is very easy to perform diagonals and rolling actions. This is a solid D-pad, and the buttons themselves feel quite satisfying to press. The screen itself is one of the biggest features of the Game Gear, now featuring a larger display than that of the Game Boys, while being filled with colors, and it is also backlit. This screen is far better than what the Game Boy offered, and it felt far more playable in many more scenarios than Nintendo's offering. On the top, you will find a volume wheel, a headphone jack, an extension port, which was just an accessory port meant to be used with things such as a gear-to-gear cable if you wanted to connect multiple Game Gears at the same time, a cartridge slot, an AC port, and a power switch. That cartridge slot means that this is also a cartridge-based system with its own proprietary cartridge, which would max out at about 1 megabytes of storage. This was pretty much identical to the Game Boy's highest capacity cartridges, but still plenty of storage for allowing developers to have more flexibility. Now finally, on the back you will find 2 battery compartments. Each one holds 3 batteries for a total of 6 AA batteries, an aspect that will be a huge part of the conversation later. Battery life on the Game Boy is quite short, lasting between 3 and 5 hours on a very good day, but 4 hours seems to be a more common estimate. Even then, the Game Gear would still offer pretty solid gaming experiences for the amount of time that you got with it. The games that did make it onto the system did a great job showing off why the Game Gear was a much more capable system than Nintendo's Game Boy. Game Gear was essentially a portable version of their already existing Master System, even if it carries a lot of the visual design cues that you would expect from their Genesis console. In terms of the games that it does play, these visuals are much more representative of their last generation, playing games that matched up decently well with their console counterparts, that being, of course, the Master System. Now, that's because a lot of titles on the Game Gear were ported from the Master System thanks to them sharing pretty similar architecture. But alas, compromises had to be made in order to get them to fit into lower capacity Game Gear cartridges, and of course, the fact that the Game Gear was still weaker than its home console variant. One of the most important titles on the Game Gear, which was Sonic the Hedgehog, looks pretty similar to the version on the Master System console, but it did come with some differences. The colors and details on in-game assets appear to have less details on the Game Gear version, which is perfectly reasonable considering what it was. Otherwise, in many ways, this is a solid port that looks pretty close to the original version of the game. Now, this wasn't all that important, as games still looked pretty good on a much smaller display such as this. A lot of these details were easy to forget about and at times just hard to notice when the overall gameplay is still pretty fun. It still felt like playing Sonic the Hedgehog, but for me, the biggest differences came with a relatively inconsistent performance. This game would slow down during certain sequences, which was something I never really experienced with the Master System version of the game. Some of the best games on this handheld include Psychic World, Tales Adventure, Streets of Rage 2, Gunstar Heroes, Phantasy Star Gaiden, Shining Force Gaiden, and of course, Sonic the Hedgehog. The Sega Game Gear could not be criticized for not being fun, although it quickly became obvious that there was plenty to be criticized about the system and the fact that the competition made it nearly impossible for Sega to climb the wall set by Nintendo. Just stated. Similarly to other powerful handhelds at this time, such as the Atari Lynx, the Game Gear struggled to make anywhere near as much of an impact as the Game Boy did. While the Game Gear had a decent amount of support and interesting ports from the Master System, the Game Boy was significantly cheaper and it offered the games that a lot of people were talking about. The Mario games are a very important part of this conversation. Tetris was also a huge deal here. Not to mention that while the Game Boy had worse visuals than most other handhelds, it still offered very fun experiences at the time, experiences that were totally unique to the Game Boy. Additionally, the Game Boy had a much better battery life while only requiring 4 AA batteries, and with subsequent models, you only needed 2 AA batteries, which also saved you more money in the long run. The Game Gear was notorious for having poor battery life, only getting up to 5 hours on a good day, mostly only lasting anywhere between 3 and 4 hours with 6 AA batteries. Most other handheld systems out on the market at this time were pretty much forgotten by most, and the Game Gear had struggled to compete in spite of its incredible features when compared to the Game Boy in relatively affordable price points. But newer models made playing on the Game Boy even cheaper and a better experience, offering a much more portable option than the rest of the competition. But of course, Pokemon was such a huge phenomenon that it put a spotlight on the Game Boy almost entirely. The Game Gear continued receiving support, but not nearly enough to really keep it relevant for much longer. All of these things essentially killed the Game Gear. This was a system that was incredibly interesting and one that Sega fans remember fondly, even if it wasn't all that popular to begin with. It had so much potential, and it was one of the most enticing handhelds that you could have looked into in the 90s. But those downsides that the Game Boy simply didn't suffer from quickly put it behind Nintendo's offering, and it sadly drifted into irrelevance within 7 years of being on the market. The Game Gear was officially discontinued on April 30th, 1997. Even then, the Game Gear is still a system that many appreciated owning, even with its concessions. However, Sega wasn't really done with the handheld market quite yet, as they moved forward with a brand new project. This one was arguably more interesting than the Game Gear itself. We will talk about this one at some point, so please make sure to subscribe, as I don't want you to miss that mini documentary when it comes out. And I'll thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and consider pressing the hype button on this video to boost it in the algorithm, and sharing it also helps out a ton. Until next time.